Okay, everybody, we're getting ready to start. Okay. Yeah, it would be nice if I could see the slides too. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Workshop 144. Advance. We'll be discussing enabling every user with a unique Internet Culture ID. We've received some feedback that the title is a little misleading, so this is in part about giving people internationalized email addresses that they can use as identifiers on the Internet. No, you went the wrong way. As you can see, we're having some resolution problems on the screen. So thank you for your patience. So I'm Mark Swanzarek. I'm from Microsoft. I'm one of the co-organizers of this event. And our agenda today is for the co-organizers to welcome you. We will have keynote presentations on various topics from various people. Then there'll be an open discussion for 45 minutes to discuss various issues related to this topic. So welcome to the event. I'd like to event Xiaodong Li, the CEO of CNNIC, whose dream it is to give everyone an internationalized email address and support internationalized domain names for everyone in China.
Thank you, Mark. This is Xiaodong Li. I'm the CEO of CNNIC. So it's my great honor to be here. So see so many old friends here. So I think it's, today's session will be happening for many times in different topic. You know, since the first IGF meeting, and also in the next couple of years, ideas have been discussed for many times. I think it's even that we need to work together to do a lot for the future development for the ID and also email address in different language. So just now I also joined the ICANN new GDPR program update in last session. I also mentioned that the community need to work together to solve the current problem to deploy the ID and also the internationalized email address. We need to aware there's a lot of tremendous effort have been made, and a lot of implementation and research effort have been deployed. So, of course, this panel also including panelists from the industry, from the email service providers. So I think I hope in the future we can have a very successful in this area. I think if we want to recall the memory from many years ago, since 1999, CNNIC and also myself have donated a lot of resources for the research of the Chinese domain name and also the Chinese email address. I think it's almost 10 years ago I co-chaired the email address internationalization working group together with Harvard in IETF to develop the internet standard, also supported by so many friends here, including John Clinton. So I think it's a big effort from the community to do that, to solve the problem. But you know now there's a lot of issues we faced. Even there's some service, email service provider support that, but because currently the email address used to be, has been used as the ID for so many systems, not only for email service. Maybe so many people never use this ID as the email service, but they will use the email address to be the ID. So that means the unique ID is a very, very critical resource for so many systems. Even for IBM and Microsoft, also some big company, just like Tencent or Baidu, Alibaba in China. So if they want to improve that system, they will face a lot of challenge how to support that. So I think there's a lot of issues to be discussed, and also, as I mentioned just now, there's a lot of effort need to be due in the future. So I hope that we community members can work together, not only for the researchers, developers, and entrepreneurs can work together to solve the problem. I have a best wishes for this session. Hope it will be a success. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Xiaodong Li. So next, we welcome our co-organizer, Microsoft and USG. Mark is working for Microsoft with 23 working experience in Microsoft. Also is a USG EIWG co-chair. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Yao. As Yao mentioned, I am on the UASG, the Universal Acceptance Steering Group. I've had a lot of roles at Microsoft, and currently one of them is to help engineering teams to evaluate new standards and opportunities based on these standards that we know have impact on customers and partners. IPv6 is one of those, EAI and IDN is another.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we welcome Wana Wait from ETDA. ETDA is one part of Thai government organization. Welcome, Wana Wait.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So, Wanawit Akubut from ETDA. So, I don't want to waste much of time from you. And I think it's an honor to be here. And thanks for the teams that we don't left the next billion that not using a Roman character. So I do hope that this session will hear some feedback from you from the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanaway. So here's our agenda, as mentioned. Andrew and John will present.
You like slides.
Pardon?
Slides.
Pardon us. No, this is right.
Okay.
I am too stupid to be the moderator.
No, you're first. So.
Please bear with us. But so for the agenda, John and Andrew will talk about their interests and concerns related to this topic. And then we'll have a number of other speakers, Microsoft, .Asia, THNIC, and we'll cover other aspects of this. So is that what, yeah?
Yeah.
Will you drive off these slides or, yeah, okay, good.
Hi, for those of you who are lucky enough not to know me, I'm John Clenson. This is Andrew Sullivan to my right. We were originally asked to do separate presentations, and we decided it would be much more interesting to do an almost unprepared dialogue discussion between the two of us. These slides are an outline, which we may not follow. The general idea is to try to share with you our perspectives less on the specifics of implementations and protocols than on the issues associated with trying to deploy these addresses, and partly in the hope that people can keep their expectations enough in line with reality that it's actually possible to succeed rather than getting bogged down forever in things which either are not desirable or which won't work. Okay, 3 buttons is forward, back, and up.
Stop, I think. So I think this is forward. Looks like forward to me. I think you have to point at the computer.
Oh. Okay. So our first issue when we started looking at this was that from the session description, as Mark sort of mentioned, it was very hard to figure out what we were talking about at this session. So I felt the first thing we should do is try to clarify that. I didn't know what cultural meant in this context, and I didn't know what unique meant in this context, and I'm not certain I knew what a user was in this context, and other than that, we were in great shape. Why don't you feel to interrupt me at any point, you?
I usually feel free to interrupt you at any point.
Excuse me. When Andrew interrupts me, it is with my permission, not as being rude. The other piece of these sort of fundamental issues we wanted to talk about was what trying to use an email address as an identifier actually means. It's widely practiced. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it could be an impediment to actually getting non-ASCII email addresses and even non-ASCII domains deployed. There's a second issue with email, which is that Mark mentioned he had been, Zhao mentioned that Mark had been at Microsoft for 33 years, 23 years. Okay, well, I have been worried since about 1980 about the question of how to give normal human beings email addresses and let them communicate with each other regardless of where they were. And one of my concerns about this work is that we try to preserve that ability of anyone on the internet who feels like doing so to communicate with anybody else on the internet they feel like communicating with. And I'm very concerned that we not lose sight of that open communication goal in the process of giving ourselves email addresses and identifiers, whether they're the same thing or not, which are much more locally and culturally compatible. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that too.
So while you're going to the next slide, I think there are 3 themes that I want to pick up here because they're individually important ones. And the first one is that there is a tendency with a number of these topics to fall into abstractions that don't always help, right? So you start with a fairly narrow problem and you think, oh, I've got this like identifier for domain names or for email addresses or something like that, and that's a fairly narrow problem. And then you realize that that thing has been reused for another purpose, like it's used for user identifiers in other systems. And then pretty quickly you're talking about like universal identifiers for people in the world. And the problem is that the last of those problems is a boil the ocean. No, it's a boil all the oceans, maybe the ones on Jupiter also, right? Like that's just too big a problem to solve. So one issue that we have here is that it's super critical when we're talking about these things to be concrete so that we can actually, get a problem that is tractable. The second one is that identifier reuse is great and it's a long tradition that we've got, but that's also the millstone that we've got to carry. The internet is already deployed, so we don't have the opportunity to just start from nothing and say, we're going to throw this all away and do something better. And some of the proposals that we sometimes hear from people sound very like, we'll just build another internet and deploy that and then everything will be great. Well, not going to happen. And I think the third thing, well, I think the 2 things are enough to get us started. So rather than blathering on, I'll let John go back.
So I've said this already. when we looked at enabling every user. Oops. Okay, well, we just may give up on this. No, it's you know, two buttons is at least one too many for me. Okay, that's where I was trying to get to. So my subtitle for our piece of this discussion is what is really the goal and what are the issues here? I was fairly certain that the way I first read and some other people had first read, the subject name probably wasn't the goal, and if it was, we were in trouble for partially the reasons Andrew mentions. Okay, yeah. So what we're hoping we can do is to get to the stage where we all have the same understanding of at least what the problem is and a close approximation to an understanding of what the goals are. And if we can't agree on that, we should at least be able to understand why we don't agree and where. So I think we're talking about cultural in terms of script and language and other issues, and not a whole series of broader but fairly important things, especially given some parts of the world. And similarly, with uniqueness, there's a question about whether we are talking about one identifier per user, which is probably not a good idea, and we'll talk more about that later, or an identifier which identifies only one user, which is a slightly easier problem, but not necessarily one that can be globally solved. Similar when we talk about email addresses as identifiers, rather than things which you use to send and receive email, there are many, many systems that accept those email addresses and think that they're identifiers. You're coming shopping on my site, please give me your email address. You come back later, we want to look it up by email address. And we've got a long history, even in the Latin character world, of databases which have the nasty property that when an email address which went in is looked up, you don't find it because the email address in the lookup process looks different from the email address in the original entry process. Internationalization doesn't create any of these problems, but it makes all of them worse, or creates greater vulnerabilities to all of them. So again, referring back to Andrew's comment about ocean boiling, having email addresses with local scripts matching people's names or whatever else they were trying to do is a far, far easier problem when those addresses are used for email than when they're used as general purpose identifiers in the internet. Doesn't say you have to solve both problems, because you may have to solve both problems. But if you define success only in terms of having a complete solution to both problems, if you're really lucky, it's 20 years off. And the other problem is the one I sort of alluded to earlier, which is that if we make our email addresses highly focused on the local language, the local script, and local culture, we then have a problem of thinking through what it continues to mean to communicate internationally. So I think we may have talked about this enough, unless there's somebody who is frightened by it still. But if we're talking about unique cultural identifiers, people have had a tendency to hear something else. And that notion of a possibly government-assigned unique identifier by which everybody in the world can be identified is, I hope, not what not anyone thinks we are talking about here. Okay, let's move on. So the question then becomes, can we have identifiers which are reasonable for the user's culture? And the answer to that question is certainly yes, up to a point. And how far one wants to push that point turns into how hard you want to make the problem to solve. had a micro conversation a couple of weeks ago that in Chinese, there are a lot of characters which Unicode has made hard to use because they haven't been in common use for anything for centuries. But they still appear in some Chinese communities in names. And if you want those characters used in the names, because it's in your personal name, to be used in email addresses, then you have a more complicated problem than if you forbid that. Now, is that important or not? I don't know. That's a cultural question. The only thing I can tell you as an outsider is that the problem gets harder if you decide you have to allow that. There are similar problems with other languages, old scripts, languages which have changed orthography and eliminated characters over the centuries. Again, if we can figure out a way to make this problem easier by constraining it, talking about getting something done in the near future becomes a great deal easier.
So I think this is an important point, and there's another way to slice it, but it's the same basic point. There are three things in tension with one another here. And the first of them is we want people to have identifiers that are natural for them to use. If you want to enter something that you can remember easily and so on, it should be like your name, or it should be like, something that is familiar to you. The second thing is that we have to deal with people communicating with one another in a shared cultural context. So people who speak the same language, or people who come from the same neighborhood, or speak the same language, or write in the same writing system, which is not necessarily the same thing as speaking the same language, right? But then we've got this third problem, which is that we want systems to be internationalized, not localized. That is, this is the distinction between having something that works for people in a particular community and something that works for everybody in every community. And depending on which one of those you want to make more important, you're going to have to make different choices about what to do, because we can't have all of them all at once immediately. And I think that is one of the big difficulties. It's unfortunate that we have this situation where we've deployed a bunch of stuff that gets in the way of these future things. But this is a classic example of that old cliche, making the perfect the enemy of the good, right? The question we have to ask ourselves is whether we want something that is at least usable for most people to get started. And I think that we sometimes skip over the distinction between those two possibilities. Speaking personally, I will confess that, because of my background, I always want to start with something and get something going before we get everything perfect, because I would rather that. But there are people who then say in response to that, well, that's unfair to me because you've left me out. And I understand that problem, but I think that is actually a difficult needs assessment problem that we have to face. And unfortunately, maybe we haven't done a good job of facing that needs assessment problem before we started working on the technologies. And so now we've got these nasty corner cases, and we've got 3 generations of them.
And because of my personality, when Andrew starts charging down fixing the things which are easy to attack first, which is a strategy I agree with, I tend to start worrying whether the road he's following leads over a cliff, and I try to map cliffs. And that's another piece of our problem here, which is that if we make early decisions and deployments which are too simplistic and ignore other kinds of options, we may find ourselves in a situation where some language or some script cannot be accommodated in any reasonable way without tearing everything else down first, and we don't want to do that. So again, there's a critical balance there, and I agree on moving forward, and I also believe we need to look ahead. Okay, we've talked about the rest of this one. Oh, goody. Well, we're not going to get to the end of this. Okay, so skip this too. Okay, no, not the last one, just skip. So I want to make one more point about this notion of unique personal names. If you compare the name John Clenson to the name Andrew Sullivan, something very interesting emerges. Or 2 things. The first one is that John C. Clenson and J.C. Clenson are unique and matched John Clenson, But Jay Clinton is not unique. And the other, while John Clinton in any of those forms is unique on the internet, there are probably a whole lot of Andrew Sullivans. And if you decide that these unique identifiers have to uniquely identify users in a way which feels good to them, we end up with solutions like Joe Smith 37254, and Joe Smith doesn't think 37254 is part of his name for some reason. And moving into multiple scripts doesn't change that problem for anybody who's the national cultural equivalent of Joe Smith. It also doesn't change the problem for anybody's national cultural equivalent of me, but I'm a special case. Next slide.
Oh, and just to make that slightly worse, remember that what we're trying to do is not uniquely identify people just for email, but you're also, because email addresses persist over time, you actually have to do this temporally, which means that if Joe Smith 37254 or whatever it was an identifier, it has to remain an identifier at least for the plausible lifetime of Joe Smith. Otherwise, it goes to the wrong person. So it's not just now that this has to be a problem, but over the course of like generational time, which is kind of awful on the internet, given that we've got like, what, 2 generations worth of time on the internet so far.
Okay, so we wanted to talk briefly about the difference between the IDN problem and the email address problem. The IDN issue is we've got a single global rigid matching system. It's deep hierarchy. When we started looking at internationalized domain names 15 or so years ago, we realized we had three basic choices about how to do that. The first one involved changing the DNS to change its matching rules and how it understood strings. And we decided we couldn't do that because it would take forever if it could happen. The second possibility was to transform all the labels via what we technically call an ASCII-compatible encoding, so that these names could sneak by applications we didn't know about them. And that's, of course, what we decided to do. And the third possibility was to adopt a 2-step resolution model involving looking at user-facing identifiers which were a little bit fuzzy and could ask questions like, do you mean this one or that one? And then go to the DNS, which was network-facing as it was originally designed, to actually look up objects. The more we find people who are saying we need to change the DNS to do various things about bundling names, about fuzzy matching, about funny cross-tree things, the more it becomes possible that we made the wrong choice, and that third choice might have been the right one in spite of the fact that it could have been deployed more quickly. So I won't belabor this more. Good news before we continue. First piece of good news is that neither email addresses nor domain names, non-ASCII characters, are needed to communicate content. And the content is almost clearly the most important part. So people need to think about what's important. It doesn't make it less offensive for people to have to use names other than in their scripts, but it's worth remembering as we proceed. Next slide. Okay, the email side of this is different and much more complicated because it is easier than the IDN side. We cannot map email addresses into some ASCII-compatible form because we've done that already for other reasons. And anybody who has an implementation which does it, I will tell you right now as a preview of the future, your implementation will not work in some important cases. You can't encode without breaking existing systems. The email rule, which is very important and which we discovered over and over again that when we violate, email stops working, is that only the target system can interpret what those addresses mean. As a consequence, you cannot in general case encode. So, IDNA situation, old applications continue to work with A labels, the puny code encoded stuff. The effect is only ugly and culturally silly. It does work. And upgraded applications are just fine. For email, the old applications simply do not work and sometimes don't work in very bad ways. And only the upgraded applications can send or receive or retrieve messages that have non-ASCII addresses or non-ASCII headers in them in either the sender or the receiver. And that's the issue people have to be clear about in this distinction and combining the two. And we've talked about this. Try to use email addresses as other than addresses, but as IDs. You may get yourself into problems. You certainly make the problem harder. And we need to think about user expectations. If a user thinks that 3 different spellings of their name are the same, we've at a minimum got a tutorial problem, an educational problem. If we really make it so that they're not the same, we tell them that the email addresses are personal identifiers. And we'll bring this back up later if we need it. And international interoperability may have different implications depending on who you're talking with. The technical stuff, we've gone off and implemented this, is the really easy part. Getting to deal with the user expectations, getting it to get deployed, getting it to work comfortably, getting it to function across national cultural boundaries is what's hard. Coming back to Andrew's earlier comment, having an implementation which works well for people in one country and one language and one culture is a really important first step, but it's really only a first step. And we're all impatient about this, and we all want to move forward with it, and that's good stuff. But if you want to understand how fast this happens, think about how long it took us to get universal availability of plain text, Latin character only email. No international characters, no international content, no multimedia. And the other question is to think about how long it's taken people to deal with reading and writing in languages they don't understand. So we look forward to other people telling us how they've solved all these problems so that we can go home and stop worrying about them, or at least telling us carefully what problems they're solving. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, guys. So now we've level set on some expectations. We've heard some of the difficulties and challenges ahead. And now I'd like to move to the next set of speakers. Who's next?
You.
Am I next? Okay.
Yes. We maybe use this.
Okay. So I'm Mark from Microsoft, as I mentioned earlier. My presentation, I just have a few slides, is to talk about how Microsoft came to be interested in this topic and what steps we've taken to address it. And the focus here will be mostly on Office 365, but not really limited to that. So our mission statement as a corporation is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And so right there, that was an interesting way of thinking about EAI and IDN. You know, if you implement these standards, that's one more way that you can empower people to use their local writing method on the internet. So it was automatically interesting to us when we saw that there was interest in the topic again, because it has been around for a long time. I don't think you can read that, and really you weren't meant to, but one of the first things we did was we evaluated what is the regional interest in these topics, who are the stakeholders in various areas like New Zealand, China, India, Russia. Are there label generation rules panels that have been convened for the areas of interest, to make it practical to create domain names and email addresses in those languages? Is it government? Is it UNESCO? Who's interested in those areas? And based on some of the information that's up here, we proceeded down the next step, thinking, okay, there's some interest there. Let's look at it again. You can't look at that either. Another way of evaluating the value of this is to think of it as a change event within not just the ecosystem, but within our customer and partner base. And so you can look at things as having various levels of impact from low to critical across different criteria, such as who is the customer segment, who is the audience, or how does this affect our brand, or is this global versus regional? Are there regulatory compliance and legal requirements? And would the adoption of this impact our market share, whether by us or by our competitors? And you can see the areas which are circled, which you can't see, show our evaluation of where the situation was when we started, and then the dashed lines show that some of the areas were likely to become more critical over time, mainly because of government regulations. So this further incented us to look at this. And so at this point, we began to think, well, what would we offer relative to this? Because, we are a software and services company, so at the end, it has to come down to very concrete sets of features. So consumer email is one of them. So thinking of Hotmail or Outlook.com, email for the masses. That's one possible scenario. It wasn't clear whether we could actually get a good return on investment on that in any short term. Commercial email service, which is provided to corporations, governments, and education, that seemed more likely and more likely to be impacted by regulations and compliance issues. We are a cloud services company, but we also have a long history doing on-premises infrastructure. You have your own servers, your own directory services, things like that. And we have a hybrid offering, where you have Office 365 or Azure, but you also have servers on-premise, and they work together. So that seemed very likely as well, because a lot of the customers who would be interested on the second bullet are tiptoeing into cloud services, and so they'd be interested in how to do something hybrid as well. We see more and more people asking to bring their own domain name, rather than saying, I'm at Office 365 at my Microsoft blah, blah, blah. You just bring, mydomain.com, and that's what your Office 365 tenant is named. And the implication of that is that you would have email addresses at that same domain. And then finally, multi-factor authentication. I don't know if any of you are forced to deal with multi-factor authentication very much, but depending on your situation, you may need to use an email address, a domain name, a password, a phone, a SIM, a biometric, some combination of those. In that situation, internationalized email addresses would also be impacting. So we decided, and I think John is right about this, we decided to focus on concrete and short-term goals first, things that we knew that we could do readily, and we decided to focus on EAI, on email. We had already made lots of investments in IDNs, and we weren't concerned about our software and services supporting them very well. We were much more concerned about EAI because we knew we hadn't implemented that end-to-end. Engineering teams had been doing opportunistic feature work for years, but never committed to doing an end-to-end. So the first thing we worked on was Outlook 2016, which is our desktop email client for Windows PCs. And that is now available. Based on that, we began to work on, an Active Directory as well. So no one uses those features as far as I can tell, but Active Directory has supported Unicode names for several generations. So with those, pardon? Yeah. So with those available, we could focus on Exchange Online, which is the Office 365 email service, which is built on the Exchange server. This is being deployed right now. In fact, if you have an Office 365 subscription, your mailbox is probably already enabled. I know there's a few percent of the mailboxes out there that are going to be in the long tail, so I can't guarantee definitively that you're enabled right now, but the chances are very good. And in progress, we have some of our other email clients, Outlook for Android, for iOS, and for Mac. And so we're hoping that this gets us most of the way through what I've been calling phase one. Phase one is being able to send and receive to and from EAI mailboxes. Phase two would be other scenarios such as sharing files on Dropbox or OneDrive addressed to people with those addresses, or using them more comprehensively as identifiers for various programs like Bing search rewards, etc. That's phase two. We're not doing that right now. We're trying to close on phase one. And we're hoping that we can bring a little bit more critical mass so that people can say, Gmail does it now, Microsoft can do it now, in addition to Core Mail and XGen Plus. So maybe we can start looking at this and feeling like it has some chance of succeeding.
And next is Adam, 7 minutes.
I will try. Thank you. First of all, this is Edmund Chung from .Asia, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. As I try to get my slide on, I guess I'm trying to, part of my presentation will try to move from a little bit more of the technical aspect that we talked about to a little bit more of the user expectation and perhaps the policy aspect of what we talk about here. Instead of using the clicker, I guess I'll just say next. So next slide. So here's really just graphically, letting people know. I think the previous three speakers have already touched on that. Email addresses are not only used to send email these days, whether it's Facebook account registration or your, many of the different social medias or any account creation utilizes an email address. And that's where some of the issues are created, and that's where it's important. And as one of the anecdotal examples, and why it's important on a policy level, there was an anecdotal example that when somebody was trying to register for their vote in the US elections, they were unable to because the US government system didn't allow certain email addresses that have a new top-level domain or utilizing different languages. I don't know whether that affected the results of the US elections, but that is besides the point. The point is, it has policy implications on how government conduct their businesses online with these identifiers. Next slide, please. And it is also some of the other areas of, one more click, some of the other areas that you find problems with introducing these new characters into email addresses are like other types of email filters or spam filters, for example, is a good example. When spam filters see that, hey, this address looks a little bit weird, they cut you out. And that has implications on the developing world where a big topic here is getting the next billion online, and more often than not, their language, their native language is not English, and if they utilize an email address with their own native language and it's blocked by spam filters, then that presents another type of challenge. That's really, in terms of policy aspect, those are the issues that we talk about. Next slide, please. And that's where universal acceptance and the universal acceptance steering group is trying to work on. And Andrew mentioned about perfect being the enemy of good. This is also how we conduct our business, looking at what the, I guess, low-hanging fruits and also where we can hit the critical mass. Because to have all the systems everywhere on the internet to be available to accept all the email addresses and all the top-level domains, is probably impossible for the foreseeable future, but we need to get to a critical mass so that these identifiers can be used. In fact, a lot of internet standards are not universally, if you view the perfect sense of universality, and that's how internet evolves. We get to the critical mass, we get to a point. But that requires your attention in terms of the on the user end and also on the policy end. Next slide, please. And in terms of the UASG, the Universal Acceptance Steering Group, one of the things that in the last couple of years we've identified a kind of a standard to think about these issues and to define it, both on the IDNs and now on the email address internationalization, how we accept, validate, store, process, and display these identifiers. And these are aspects that you need to look at in terms of your system, whether it's a government system or a corporate system, how to deal with these identifiers coming in. Next slide, please. And in terms of our progress, the current, before that, that's the exciting slide. Keep going.
Oh, keep going. Okay.
Yeah, so the current projects on EAI, in fact, we're excited to see that there's a growing participation. And if you're still interested to participate, look for UASG, Universal Acceptance Steering Group, on the ICANN website, and it's an open mailing list. Just send an email in to join. I'm guessing it does not support EAI just yet, so please use an ASCII email address. Unfortunately.
2 minutes left.
All right. So then there are a number of guides that we're working on, and please do participate. So next slide. But we go back to a question: do people actually use it? A lot of people say, no, but nobody uses these names. I guess it's also a matter of chicken and egg problem. But one of the things that I'm excited about, next slide, is actually things are going to change. Today, maybe typing in an email address in your own native language is a challenge, but one more click. But think about the audio input when you're with your mobile phone. That's going to change a lot. That's going to change a lot of things, and we know that how mobile internet is going to change. It's hard to imagine Chinese users or Arabic users speaking English to their phone and trying to send an email to somebody else. And that's when email address internationalization or IDNs is going to really matter and it's going to make a difference. And that's why the bringing on the next billion, this is going to be an important. Next slide, please. And and the other thing that is coming along, next click, Internet of Things. Again, speaking to your fridge, highly unlikely you will use English rather than your native language. I know this is a slide I've shown many years, and Hong Ning here is saying that I should not, I should have some progress. So next slide is the progress. We are doing something, but I won't use it is possible to use domain names for Internet of Things. Next slide, please. Because I'm running out of time. But another important aspect is sustainable development goals. This has relation to sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. And especially in infrastructure development, I won't go through them in details, but 8, 9, 11, 12, they all include aspects of how infrastructure is developed with the local localization and the local community in consideration. And EAI and IDNs are all part of that, because if you think about the internet, we often think about it as an international tool, but it's as important in the local condition. Your local company talking to your local audience, that's where EAI and IDN is going to play a role. Next slide, please. And that also has an aspect on the cultural diversity and heritage aspects of the SDGs. So 4, 6, 8, 11, 12, 13, 15, all talks about the heritage and cultural aspects. And I'll jump to the last slide if you can keep jumping. And that's why AGI is involved. And in education, that's what we're trying to do. And AGI, which is our tiger, is also focused on sustainable development, of course helping tigers, but also universal acceptance. I won't talk about this, but you can come to our booth and I will explain why SDGs and universal acceptance are actually, a very important part of it, because of the enabling of the local community in terms of infrastructure development, and also in terms of heritage protection, protecting, and also thriving language and cultural aspects for the internet. So thank you.
Thank you. Next slide. Next is Marvin.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Marvin Wu from Cornell, China. Cornell is the first EI provider, and today I will, as a provider, to share some experience of EI. I use my EI account for work every day, almost 1 year. So I feel something. In 2012, Cornell can support EI is the first EI provider. So we found some difficult. For example, no client to support EI. And netizens ask me if I want to catch a EI account, which place? So we do something. Next. So now, Cornell release some client with iOS, Android, Windows, like mobile client and PC client. I use this client work every day, almost 1 year. Use my EI account, and I delete my English email address. Also, I only use my EI email address to send email, Next. And we, with Scenic together, we released an EI platform for netizens to applicant some EI account like this. Now, we catch more than 100,000 users. Next. And this is some commercial example. In China, we have an enterprise custom named Hui. It built a really EI system for the custom. And so this is the first really we catch money to our custom. Okay. Now I have some challenges. And the first is EI is limited in a local cycle. For example, my father, he fairly like EI account because he can't understand English. But for my foreign friends, like Pennsylvania, like Mark, you can't understand my Chinese email address. It's very terrible for you. So EI account is used in a local cycle, I think. Another challenge is few applicants to accept EI account as a registered ID. So it's an endless loop. No application can accept EI email address. So no people like to use. And software provider have no interest to improve the system. And few people use EI account. It's an endless loop. This is my field. Like Apple, Google, Microsoft. And also, as email address as a registered ID. So it's really an ID, but they can't accept EII account. If I use a Chinese or another EII email address to register, it can't accept. So the real ID, but can't use to our internet application. The last part is, I think maybe in the future we can use email address as like this in a local cycle. Our user like to use EII, but in different country or different language, they can't use it. So I think Punicode maybe is necessary for a long time, because so maybe several millions of service for enterprise build itself. So they can't upgrade the system. So I think maybe Punicode is necessary for a long time in the future. And
Last 30 seconds.
yeah, okay. This is common to something like Microsoft's Exchange Online. We released our common SaaS custom. Also, all of them can support EII. Okay, that's all.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Marvin. Next up, we have Pensri from ETDA.
Sorry.
Oh, from THNIC, sorry. Now, I think you have a file compatibility problem, or?
PDF you cannot open?
Yeah, so we can't display her presentation right now, so she'll just have to speak to it.
So we can open proprietary formats, but not PDF.
Okay, I'm Pensi Arunaratana Mongkon from THNIC. Actually, our aims is to bring millions of Thai who are not familiar with like English character. They cannot recognize, they cannot write. So I think the IDN and EAIs are necessary for them. So we start our journey in 2011, where we provide Thai IDN. At that time, EAI was tested with help from affiliates. And from 2014 until now, we joined many activities and did many tests. Finally, in June this year, we started to offer the Thai EAI service in .thai domain name for the .thai domain name owners using Webify cost flow platform, and we plan to provide free EAI email account to Thai people in February next year, so that they can have their internet identity. So today, actually, I would like to share my experience in implementing EAI, but we cannot see that one. We can show later. So we list problem that we face. Like the first one is deliverable. That means to deliver email address that is using EAI to the server that do not support EAI. We need solution. So cost for use, they provide ASCII and non-ASCII account address and point to the same email box to solve this one. And they are like, the system is SMTP UTF-8 enabled. The next issue we found is the interoperability, as different systems might use different encoding. So we found that the message from cross-forward display incorrectly, and that lead to incorrect address when receiver try to reply. To solve this issue, Cloud4 reorder the header by placing the content type and encoding at the top of the header. Next interoperability issue is data format compatibility. So we can have like UTF-8, add UTF-8, or you can have other type, like, you need to show that, it's okay. So Cloud4 need to be able to display all of them and then convert them to Unicode format before sending back. As we talk about interoperability, we need to work on each email system one by one. So, or case by case basis. It would be helpful if we can have like the best practice so that all of us can follow, and maybe global scale of interoperability activities are also needed. Next issue is that there is no client application now that can do POP and IMAP for Unicode account. Microsoft said that Outlook 2016 can do that, right?
I thought so, yeah. Did your tests show otherwise?
Maybe we need to work out
Yeah,
like
okay.
interoperability. Yeah, okay.
Bugs are also always welcome.
Right. So currently only webmail can do, and TrueWave is inform us that they will develop a client application for our user. Yeah. And to provide AI address for our user, we also want other service provider that they can receive and reply back to our user. So we build up a wiki page to tell the small email service provider basic guideline to set up their EAI by turning on the EAIs if they are using Postfix. So as many of you said, we need like big player like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Apple to fully support EAI so that the ecosystem can happen. So the last, actually I would touch the same like UA ready, user acceptance ready, that user can use their EAI to register for like Facebook, Twitter, banks, or even government services. So we would need to reach them. So I think UAST is doing that one. So, okay, that is my presentation. Thank you.
So thanks, Pensri. Her presentation actually has a lot of great diagrams in it to show what they're doing and how they're implementing it. So let us know if you would like to see that afterwards. So that's the end of our prepared speakers. And now we'd like to have an open discussion, and we'd like to maybe break into groups to talk about things like real world deployment experiences, what we've learned, challenges and issues that remain, how we can enable every user with an internet ID, discussion of whether or not email addresses are good internet IDs or not. I think that'll be enough for now. So. Yeah, I don't know, should we divide into?
You're the moderator.
I'm the moderator, okay, so perhaps we could, yes, question.
Yes,
Are there some questions?
yes, it's a question. Or maybe a set of comments as well. Because I'm still grappling to get on board with your premises that an email address can be used as an identifier. Because it's counterintuitive. We have a lot of places where we need to provide, when we provide, even email address providers ask for other factors for authentication, two-factor authentication, especially phone numbers, because phones are very individuals, and they know that when they send a code, you'll be the one receiving it, and it's kind of more reliable in practice because people use phone for a lot of things every day, etc. But we have a lot of issues, spam, and I mean, many people have my email address that I never met, and they send me junk email and all that. So anyone who has my email address can pretend to be me. If you use an email address as identifier, that's a problem. And note that even governments issued ID is not just the name that's an identifier. It's a triangulation of many, several bits of data. It's the name, it's the date of birth, it's the place of birth, and gender, and all sorts of things. So it's a triangulation of those data points that makes it more likely that the credential represents uniquely an individual. So I still don't understand how you use an email address as identifier, especially that you didn't mention any other factors. If you had in mind a password, the problem is passwords are things that are very annoying and very, I mean, they are not manageable on the long run, and a lot of people in the technical world are thinking about how to get rid of passwords. So you have a lot of identity technologies being developed. The latest one I heard of is the distributed ledger technology, like blockchain and stuff like that. So for me to hear that email addresses will be used as identifiers, like going backwards. So can you explain that?
Thank you for your feedback. I think Andrew would like to answer first.
Thank you. So this is exactly in line with, I think, some of the remarks that John was making at the beginning. That is, what you have to do before you start saying, here is a thing that we're going to use as an identifier, is that you have to ask, so what is this an identifier for? What is the purpose to which you're going to put this piece of identity information, and what consequences follow from that? And so if I'm going to use my email address as an identifier, say, to Twitter, so that I can also generate then a Twitter handle from that so that people can identify me within the Twitter system, that has certain implications, like, for instance, that people can, tweet things to me. But it's rather less important, really, I think, that people be able to get their tweet information to me than, for instance, that my tax return be identified and associated with me, because one of those things sends me to jail if I do it wrong, and the other one doesn't. And so those kinds of things are among the questions that we have to ask. And I think what John was saying at the beginning of this was, the initial scope seemed to be this enormous problem of like unique identifiers for individuals, and then it turned out actually that the scope of this is enabling people with an identifier that they can use when they go out into the world to identify themselves consistently across systems, and building on top of the EAI system. That is a very different problem, and I think that you're right to ask whether these two things are the same thing, because I don't believe they are. And more importantly, there is the follow-on question of whether we actually want people to have a singular unique identifier that carries across all of the systems. Personally, I would say that is very close to the worst idea I've heard all week. So I think that that's a really bad idea. But, people could have a discussion about that. But I think that what we tried to do at the beginning of the session was narrow the scope so we weren't also tackling that problem, because I think it would be a very different discussion we'd be having.
Yeah, just a quick addition. I hate the idea of using email addresses as identifiers for all of the reasons you mentioned and several more. Our difficulty is that it has become an extremely popular habit in a very large portion of the world. Good reasons or bad reasons, whether we can get people to back away from that habit or not, is an open question. We need to understand better as we move into this new phase of identifiers or of email addresses, just how far we want to go in that direction and what the implications are. I would even disagree with something Andrew said, which is that one can have a perfectly good email address without implying that it's an identifier at all, and maybe that's an option we should be pursuing. But again, my main argument is we should be thinking about these things. One additional thing for everybody, I'm going to make a personal plea. Get the term EAI out of your vocabulary before it causes far more confusion with all of the other three-letter magical acronyms floating around. Talk about it as internationalized email if you want to. Use the correct technical term, which is SMTP UTF-8, but let's stop talking about EAI, which was merely the name of an IETF working group, which we picked one afternoon when we were angry because all the other names have been taken and we were trying to keep it short. Let's try not to use that as a terminology generally in talking with each other and especially in talking with other people because we would just create confusion.
I think that explains why it's EAI and not IEA, which I've always wondered about.
Yeah, and if you know what an IEA is, you probably know why.
Edmund.
Yeah, so I guess that's part of the identifier problem, right? So in response, the way I see it, actually, email address is one type of identifier. It doesn't have to be the only identifier. You have, like, in your physical world, you have your passport number, you have your license number, you have your physical postal address, you have your phone number. I guess one of the key aspects that at least I want to talk about, and I think the group wants to talk about, is think about your phone number. In my place in Hong Kong, in my lifetime, we've moved from 6 digits to 7 digits to 8 digits now. We're talking about databases that is only able to accept phone numbers in 6 digits and choke on 7 or 8 digits. Here is the case where systems use email addresses, whether they are as identifiers or not, but they, now that we've introduced other languages or other characters into email addresses, those databases now start having problems. So I think that is a bigger problem that we need to think about and address. Whether it becomes the only identifier, I don't necessarily think that's the pertinent kind of question we're asking. But and back to, it is already being used as a kind of identifier. So let's make sure that the identifiers, the systems can use the new types of email addresses, which includes native characters, and that's, I think, an important aspect.
Just to clarify, I wasn't assuming that you wanted to be the unique identifier for anything. Even my name, in some contexts, is an identifier. In my family, I'm the only one called Mawaki, so it's an identifier, right? But the question is, for what it's worth, what are we going to do with it? Why taking it from the status of being just email address to an identifier status? For what? That's the underlying question.
Okay, so we have Wanawit, then the gentleman there, and then Xiaodong.
Yes, I would like to point out one of the key aspects that's been overlooked. The email is part of the credential that required to use in the e-signatures. In the world, we have 137 trade agreements. In the Pacific alone, 37. There are 27 measures talk in the trade agreement. 50% of them talk about the measure related to the e-signatures. What are we going to do? What the community going to give the answer? Government have to issue the paper. Email identifier is only means to be used. And it has been stated there. I don't know whose fault it's this. But that is the expectations from the world that we're living with. People do not know what is the problems there. I'm not talking about the identifier used across. the system, but even within system, like Thai people, we don't use the Latin characters. None of the government officers carrying the official Latin names. So how could you know that these are the qualified or his credential could be able to sign this phytosanitary document and send across border? And I think what I'm talking here is not about the open identity or using, but is there as part of the credential need to provide to authenticate the trade documents. And the baseline is there, the trade facilitation agreement already reached 100 countries, 8 countries to go. We expect next year will close. We have 1 year, 147 countries. If you look into the list, 80% of them not using a Latin. The problem is far more bigger than what we're talking here. It's not talking about this kind of messaging system. What IGF gives to us is a non-fragmented architectures of electronic mails or whatever you like to call SMTP. Without doing this, the world get into the fragmented of the web applications that none of the government will accept. Who's gonna be the primary government? Email is the only means that can maintain the collaboration works, exchanging documents. If you don't do anything, I don't know how the world gonna lead it to. Maybe all the Thai government civil servants need to have an English name within the next 3 years. And I don't know, I don't have the solutions, but I think if you talk about chicken and egg problem, there's a paper published. The measure I've been talking about is these e-signatures. And I do believe whatever you like to call EI or email is a basic credential of how we communicate. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanawit. The closer gentleman.
So I put my hand up a few minutes ago because I thought Andrew was seriously overthinking the problem. And I think 2 of the people who've spoken since I put my hand up initially have actually identified this a little bit better than I could have, so I'm going to draw on their words. The first is people don't actually want to use email identifiers. They want to use email as a return routability check. So it's an extremely basic form of proof of possession. You claimed X, and I can actually send you a piece of message that you can use some piece of text in to say, I got it, therefore we've established some return routability check. And it's a bootstrapping mechanism for far more complicated things. And as Edmund pointed out, lots of systems have actually abandoned email as the bootstrapping mechanism and have gone to bootstrapping based on telephone systems instead. WhatsApp has built up more than 1 billion users without ever knowing your email address because they have a different bootstrapping mechanism involved. And so I think one of the questions that kind of reads on the gentleman's point here about what are we going to do is one question we can ask ourselves isn't so much can we deal with the tension of the fact that email has already been deployed for 30 years and changing it is very painful, with China has been deployed for a good bit longer and changing it is equally painful or maybe more so, by saying are there other fairly simple bootstrapping mechanisms which are out there which may serve a similar purpose to get us to an identifier that is in fact useful for some of these use cases like digital identity. But I don't think it's really practical for us to look at this and say, we are going to abandon this problem because, as has been pointed out here, at the moment, the email system does not provide an effective return routability check for a very large part of the world because they can't create email addresses that make sense in their environment. They can't get them delivered by many of the systems that haven't been upgraded. So it doesn't work for this. Maybe it's not the right answer for this. Maybe we just say, hey, if what you're looking for is a return routability check, you need something that is, in fact, a simpler mechanism than that. And maybe it is based on E164 numbers or something that doesn't have the same internationalization consequences of a text string. but leaving these people out of the world we're creating because of backwards compatibility with one particular mechanism is hopefully going to push them into other mechanisms people adopt, or hopefully push us to create ones that work.
Thank you.
It's just a quick comment. I think I just wanted to aware you that whatever you like it or not, the email address, the email address, the user has choose the email address to be the identifier for so many applications and the internet service. So I think it's because the email is not only email, it's a very good profile, which is a combination of personal name or identifier, institutional name, and also maybe include the country name. So that is the natural way to identify one person in the real world. So we cannot change the requirement of the people. They want to use some kind of culture name to identify themselves. Maybe it's email address, maybe it's another thing, something else. I think we need such kind of a combination to identify ourselves. It's my comment.
Thank you.
Thanks. Just very quickly, because one of your questions at the beginning was around what other sort of possible means and mechanisms could we investigate to act as identity. I come from the GSMA, the Global Mobile Industry Association. I just wanted to add that we have actually a couple of digital ID initiatives that are based on the premise that individuals can use their phone number as a means of authentication and accessing services. Now, clearly, we're not saying this is the only means available, but depending on the use case, the mobile number could be one option. So there are different levels of assurance, authentication. So accessing Twitter versus accessing a bank account would require different levels of assurance. But we do believe that mobile operators are in a good position to be able to leverage on existing assets to authenticate a user against a third-party service. And we invite in this session to speak to us and learn more about our initiatives. But we certainly believe that mobile numbers can act as identity sort of credential to accessing third-party services. Thank you.
Yeah, we do agree that there's multiple forms of identity that could be prepared. I think back to the keynote at ICANN 57 a few weeks ago, where they were discussing people who can't afford to have their own mobile device and have to share their terminal devices. So there are other issues to involve in some use cases. But certainly this is a welcome feedback. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I just thought of some, thanks to Edmund, I just thought of some very important social role this AI factor can play, because I've just learned at the previous session that there are 7,000 languages spoken in the world, right? And 90% of the global population communicate in languages other than English. Now, if we imagine, if we just try to extrapolate the current situation, if we imagine that those people go online, I mean, connecting, not unconnected, and they may still be illiterate at that time. So probably that EI, I mean, which may be composed, for example, of their own name or something like that, might be the only identifier which they could use when dealing, for example, with that Internet of Things stuff. Simply because they can they speak out their name rather than a phone number. And that might be a very important factor. So I think that is kind of a little bit arrogant for now to decline or just to dampen the idea that AI may not be used as that key identifier for many in the world, because simply, first of all, many of us can speak at least some English, and second, we have some means to live on. So we cannot imagine the gravity of the challenge for those for that 54% of yet unconnected. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very quickly, this is Barry Liba. Did you get anything out of this session? Did you get what you were hoping to? I didn't, so I'm wondering if you did.
Well, actually, I'm hoping you could tell me more about what you were expecting. Personally, I feel like I got a lot out of this just from conversing with John, frankly. But it's great to hear this feedback from the audience as well.
Well, then to follow up, I was hoping to see a conversation about what we're really looking for and how we can get there. And what I got was a lecture on why it's difficult, which I already knew, which is why I didn't get anything out of it. And, I've talked with John many times about this, so. But the conversation didn't seem to happen.
Hi, Barry. One of the things that we wanted to do, I've been working with the Indian community a lot with EAI, and we're going to have a session at 4:30 tomorrow on next steps. Where do we go from here? And really pinning down the problems, the requirements, and I know you guys everybody's going to get all mad at me, but transition mechanisms, okay? Interoperability and deployment kinds of things. I mean, you guys know that I'm pretty hardcore and practical. So I'd like to have a practical discussion. So anybody who'd like to, please come. And thank you guys. I love hearing everybody. Yeah.
Thanks, Deleva. I had actually hoped that the presentation would give people some hope. I mean, the UASG always gets on stage and talks about how hard things are, but then we try to show some forward progress, and I think we generally do a good job lately of avoiding the "it's so hard" story and get to this is what we accomplished this quarter. And so I had hoped that Microsoft's recent success, even though we have this very broad portfolio of products and services, we've actually made great progress becoming compatible. Pensry's presentation, which unfortunately you weren't able to see, about an actual system that they've built, a hybrid solution for government use. But apparently, yeah, it didn't come through, and it didn't enable the conversation that you were hoping for, and I apologize.
More comments. So, originally, Mark and me initially this workshop, our initiative is help the deployment of IETF, EI, and IDN standards. So make more email service providers and to support EI and IDN are more easily accepted by the application systems. Thank you.
Yeah, you don't put me in front of a microphone if you expect to hear tales of how easy things are going to be. At the same time, I'm actually very encouraged by this. I'm encouraged by the number of implementations we've seen. I'm encouraged by commitments about other implementations. As I say, it's a first step. And I'm very concerned that we put barriers in our way by either over-promising or making the problem bigger. I think the jury is still very much out on the identifier question rather than on the email question. And I think it's in our interest to look at that harder. And Ted's comments and several of the comments from the floor are very much in line with that. But I'm actually feeling fairly encouraged because I didn't expect to be where we are today for about another 3 or 4 years.
All right, we're out of time. They've actually let us run over. So thank you everyone for attending and for staying all the way to the end.